for this Clinker lecture, Shirley Levon and Lesley Taylor of the Wakefield Historical Society. And for the Society, they have recently edited the reports which Smeaton left of his work on the Calder navigation in the early 1760s. This gives a great deal of light on how navigations in general, as well as this one in particular, were conducted, how the work on them was carried out at the time. So I'm sure we have a very interested audience here gathered. I would like to ask anyone who is not already muted to mute themselves and call on our speakers to deliver this year's Clinker lecture on John Smeaton and the Calder navigation. Thank you.
Play from the start. Play from the start, that's it.
There we go.
Okay. Can everybody see that? Are we okay. So I'm going to start. I'm Lesley, and Shirley and I will be telling you a little about the scheme to extend the navigation on the Calder above Wakefield in the mid-18th century. I'll be looking at the historical background leading up to the start of the construction. But first, let me tell you how this unlikely piece of research began. It was 2013 when Wakefield Historical Society started a major project about Wakefield waterfront. Let me just show you this, where this is on this aerial photo. At the top left of the picture is the bridging point of the Calder on this great loop of the river. This is the main route out of the town to the south, crosses the wide 20th century bridge over the river before it divides into the roads to Doncaster, Barnsley and beyond. And if we look in more detail at this area, to the right of the new bridge, we can see the medieval bridge with its chantry chapel in the middle. And this was Wakefield's road over the river for many centuries. The collection of roofs at the bottom of this image is the Hepworth Gallery, which has brought the art world to Wakefield in recent years. And just left of the gallery on the riverbank is an ancient mill building, the Upper Mill, now wrapped up prettily by the Hepworth until some purpose is found for it. And I'll be mentioning that later. And crossing the river from outside the Hepworth is the Great Weir. And a weir has been on this site since medieval times. And here is the river and weir from the Hepworth Gallery. The weir was built to provide power to turn the water wheels of the mills on the river. But it also created a long, wide reach of still water upstream. And this upstream area above the weir and round the bend of the river was the focus of our waterfront project. And during the 19th and part of the 20th century, this was densely packed with malt houses, warehouses, mills, housing. Today, it's much quieter. Some of the surviving buildings are being put to new uses. The mills in the centre are in the process of being completely restored by an ambitious London company. But our main interest has been in the 18th century history of Wakefield. And whilst our fellow society members found lots of material for the 19th century and later, it seemed that it was quiet on the waterfront before that. There were important dye houses and the water mills on the weir. But then Shirley and I began to think about the coming of the new navigation. And today, looking across the reach, we can see on the left the whole of the beautiful Calder and Hebble navigation warehouse, built in the later 18th century, and now sympathetically renovated for offices. It stands today on part of the croft, that's the piece of land purchased to set up the navigation workyard in 1760. And on the right, we're looking straight down the cut past the flood lock and under the Barnsley and Doncaster roads to rejoin the Calder beyond the lock at the far end. And there the link is made into the Ayr and Calder navigation well below the weir. And the original line of this cut, constructed by the engineer at that time, John Smeaton, went straight across into the Calder on the shortest route. So Shirley and I realised that when this upper Calder navigation was begun, it must have been very busy on this part of the reach. And we looked for books and documents which could tell us about this venture. I'd already been aware of the Royal Society's collection of Smeaton's drawings and plans relating to Wakefield. And in the National Archives, we found more early papers in the Calder and Hebble collection. In particular, Smeaton's journal, covering the first 4 years of the project, 1760 to 63. And by the end of that time, the centre of operations had moved to Dewsbury from Wakefield. So these, as good members of the Wakefield Historical Society, were the exact years we were looking for. The full transcription of this journal is in our book. There were many other documents in this collection too, covering these early years, the minutes, accounts, many letters passing between the main actors, and others as the navigation planning came together and the work started. We were spoilt by this wealth of material. Of course, we're not the first to have used these papers, but with a strong Wakefield perspective and a close focus on the organisation of the local planning and work and of working relationships, we hope we brought something fresh to the story. Okay, first a look at transport options in the 18th century. This is the contemporary view from a treatise on inland navigation, which clearly expresses the situation by the 1760s. All nations agree that commerce is the only means to render a state flourishing and formidable to its neighbour. And since by foreign navigation it procures so great advantages, it is natural to infer that by inland navigation it must produce, in small, the same effect. It is by them that traffic can animate all parts of the state and procure plenty and happiness to the people. In fine, by canals, we can readily be supplied with grain, forage, fuel, materials for building, and in one word, all heavy materials, which remain of little value 18 or 20 miles from the place they are wanted, because of the great expense commonly attending their transportation by carriage. And here we have the limitation of road transport at a time when trade and prosperity were growing very rapidly, particularly in the West Riding. Horse-drawn wagons struggled with heavy goods, and the state of the roads often made travel very difficult, particularly those climbing into the Pennines. Roads were still in most places the responsibility of the parishes through which they passed, a situation which was becoming increasingly unsatisfactory. So there was a strong focus on using water at this time. As you'll know, this lesson was learnt early in our area. This is a rough map of the Ayr and Calder navigation as it was then. It linked the towns on the left here, Leeds on the Ayr and Wakefield on the Calder, by river to the Ouse and on into the Humber and the sea, and it opened in the first years of the 18th century. It made its initial investors from Leeds and Wakefield very rich, and the middlemen and merchants of those towns benefited too by controlling the movement of goods and the processing to be done, such as cloth dressing and dyeing and malting of corn and sorting of wool. It wasn't easy. The Ayr and Calder at that time was windy, very slow, easily silted up, expensive. There was also a general belief that profits went into dividends rather than repairs and improvements. But as you can see, it brought water transport many miles into the heart of the West Riding. And here is the headquarters of Wakefield's branch of the Ayr and Calder, just downstream of the old bridge in 1756. The building in the centre left, still stands. And here are the keels which have come up the Goit, which is a West Riding word for the small waterway into the navigation yard. And the warehouse here was the great marker of trade. But from the earliest suggestions of using the Calder as a navigation at all, there had been calls from further up the river to share in the benefits of water transport. Merchants and many others up the valley, Halifax, Ellen, Sowerby Bridge, and over the Pennines to Rochdale and beyond, were keen to continue upstream from Wakefield, but their pressure had always failed. In 1738, they again initiated an attempt to obtain an Act of Parliament, always a time-consuming, expensive and uncertain undertaking. They commissioned a survey and a plan from an engineer with experience with navigation construction from Lancashire, Thomas Steers, and his mapmaker, John Ives. It was their view that a navigation above Wakefield was a possibility, and this is the plan they made. Navigations were popular at the time, and the Calder promoters were optimistic of success when their bill was presented to Parliament in the winter of 1740-41. However, they had not bargained with the opposition from downstream in Wakefield. The Reverend Cavendish Neville of Shevat Hall was the owner of the soak mills on the weir at Wakefield, where all the town had to grind their corn. And Neville, like all other local mill owners, was fearful for his water supply. A particular concern was that poor locks or careless boatmen wasted water. And many others from Wakefield and Leeds too did not wish to see their cargoes bypassing their quays and the centre of trade shifting westward. So Neville was able to build up a powerful campaign amongst the landed gentry, the mill owners and the merchants and clothiers in our area. And his aim was to prevent the passage of this bill through Parliament, as is revealed in a set of his papers in the Yorkshire Archaeological and Historical Society archives. Also, during the same parliamentary sessions of 1740-41, several local turnpike bills were heard, because Turnpike Acts gave trustees the power to construct better roads and take tolls to maintain them. And the local routes proposed were Leeds to Elland, Halifax to Bradford, Wakefield on to Doncaster and the Great North Road. And there was also a route from Halifax to Wakefield and then on eastward to beyond Pontefract and Nottingley to meet the Aire downstream of the old Aire and Calder navigation. And the committee stages for turnpike and navigation bills were heard within a few days of each other. And the evidence from one seemed to influence the thinking about the other. They came to be seen, I think, as alternatives. And perhaps because the turnpikes were acceptable to most members of Parliament, but the proposed navigation was still causing bitter disagreement. The Turnpike Acts were all passed and the navigation bill was shelved as session time ran out. The Upper Calder promoters were devastated, taken by surprise by Neville's campaign, but they learned from this experience. They left the idea for a number of years so they might, in their words, remove every objection which has hitherto or can possibly, with any appearance of reason, be urged against the scheme. By 1757, they were ready to launch the process again. And this was done at a meeting at the Talbot Inn in Halifax, where a committee was formed to consider proper measures to obtain an Act of Parliament for making the River Calder navigable from Wakefield to Elland and on to Halifax. And this venture immediately looked very promising for a number of reasons. Firstly, that the leading name on that committee list was that of Sir George Savile. So George Savile, 8th Baronet of Thornhill, grandson of the Reverend John Savile, of Rector of Thornhill. He inherited Rufford Abbey in Nottinghamshire, had a London townhouse, but he spent considerable time in the West Riding. And at his death was buried in the family vault at Thornhill, above the Calder, near Dewsbury. A Whig with liberal views widely liked, he was unopposed when he was elected as one of the 2 members of Parliament for Yorkshire in 1759. He was very close to the Marquis of Rockingham of Wentworth Woodhouse, the leading Whig in the north, who became Prime Minister on 2 occasions. In this period, portraits tended to show the interests or occupations of the sitter. And here we have George Savile pointing to a plan, undoubtedly that of the Calder navigation. He remained stalwart in his support of the scheme for over many years and despite many difficulties. And the other supporters of the scheme were a powerful group made wealthy by the highly successful West Riding woolen manufacturing, a mix of merchants, manufacturers, bankers and professional men from the Upper Calder towns. And this is a portrait of John Cagill, who later provided the land in the centre of Halifax on which to build the spectacular Peace Hall, still the centrepiece of Halifax, as a new marketplace for cloth. And at the Talbot meeting too, it was immediately proposed that John Smeaton should be approached to look at the river, with a view to employing him to plan and realise the scheme. Now, most people know Smeaton from the project which is shown here on his portrait, the Eddystone Lighthouse, on which he was employed from 1756 to 1759. In fact, at the time of this meeting, the Eddystone was his first major engineering triumph. And as you'll know, he's often regarded as the first civil engineer, as engineering began to emerge as a profession. So a little about Smeaton's Yorkshire background. Born in 1724, he grew up at his family home at Austhorpe, which is east of Leeds, about 10 miles north of Wakefield. He went to Leeds Grammar School, but he abandoned the legal training his father desired because he preferred to continue in the home workshop he'd set up as a youth, conducting experiments in mechanics and designing apparatus. He was completely self-motivated, studying astronomy and learning French to further his research. But at the age of 24, he moved to London, where he set up a successful business as an instrument maker. And by 1751, he began to conduct experiments on wind and water power using working models. His skills were recognised by the influential members of the Royal Society. And in 1753, aged only 28, he was made a fellow. And today there's a large collection of Smeaton's papers and reports and plans in their archives. And then in between his research and his visits abroad to see the latest drainage and canal systems and windmills, he began to take engineering commissions. And these, of course, allowed him to understand more about the power of water and wind through practical applications. And this brought him up north again to Wakefield. In 1754, he was commissioned to design a watermill on Wakefield Bridge for Sir Lionel Pilkington, the new owner of the Wakefield soak mills. There are a number of plans and drawings of the mill, but this has such wonderful draftsmanship. It's a wonderful plan. He was always experimenting here, and he used this opportunity to try to establish the most economical use of water to turn a wheel. More detail appears on this image as it's enlarged. It's fantastic. And here is the mill building when it was completed on the same 1756 oil painting. This was designed by Smeaton. It's standing behind the Chantry Chapel, but on the upstream side of the bridge, below a much lower soak mill belonging to Sir Lionel. And Smeaton also mentioned other work he'd done for Sir Lionel. Across the weir, in buildings now in front of the Hepworth, he'd set up 3 small wheels, 2 for fulling and 1 for frizzing or freezing, which is a process in the cloth finishing. It is no wonder that when Smeaton began working for the Halifax Committee, he said of Sir Lionel, whose predecessor owner of the soak mills, Neville, had been so obstructive, "Nothing can have happened more lucky than what I have done for him." In 1754, Smeaton was back in Wakefield. He designed a windmill for Mr. Roodhouse of Westgate for the production of rapeseed oil and logwood for use in dyeing. And here it is standing above the Ings behind Westgate in Wakefield from a painting of 1793. Another aspect of Smeaton's work was in our area at this time too. He prepared plans for the water supply at the Foundling Hospital at Ackworth, between Wakefield and Doncaster, now Ackworth School, which was built in the late 1750s. And this was a branch of Coram's Hospital for Foundlings in London, which had caught the imagination there of fashionable society. And here too, it attracted the great and the good. The committee which consulted Smeaton included the Marquis of Rockingham, Lord Irwin from Temple Newsham, and Sir Rowland Wynne from Nostell Priory, the great landowners in our area. So Smeaton seemed to have become the go-to engineer in this area at this time. And later was to say that Wakefield is a town where I have many acquaintance. He was explaining why he couldn't concentrate on working at Wakefield and needed to go back to Austhorpe for peace and quiet. Of course, at home, he had his young apprentice from Plymouth, William Jessop, assisting with many of the drawings Smeaton required. So Smeaton's practical experience, combined with his experiments, his reading, his visits, and his models, contributed to an important paper for the Royal Society entitled An Experimental Inquiry Concerning the Natural Powers of Water and Wind to Turn Mills, which he presented to the members in the summer of 1759, and for which he was awarded the highly prestigious Copley Medal. So Smeaton, not only an expert on mills and water power, with experience already on the Calder, but also very well known and highly regarded in the area, must have been the perfect engineer to help the Halifax Committee to success in Parliament. And so it was that in 1759, he began work with the Halifax Committee by surveying the river, using I's plan, and he too reported that the scheme was possible. He visited all the owners of the riverside land with the instruction that he should minute down every objection. The approach was to diffuse all opposition by answering objections, reconciling interests. There was to be no doubt about the outcome of another navigation bill. Smeaton had by then prepared a report on the river, which was widely circulated. He'd calculated that the length of the navigation would be 23.5 miles and would rise 154 feet from Wakefield to the mouth of Halifax Brook, before the steep climb into Halifax, which was an extra 24 feet. And by December 1757, the committee were ready to see how effective their approach had been. They called a meeting at the White Hart, one of the main inns in Wakefield, at which all landowners or others who were in any ways concerned are desired to attend. And 2 mill owners were the only voices to offer any objections. Sir Lionel himself was not there, although he and they later petitioned against the bill, but there was no concerted opposition campaign like that of Neville's previously. So Smeaton eventually had his own plan ready after it had been beautifully engraved in London. It's full of information, the sites of locks, cuts, weirs and bridges to be built, with tables to identify these. He marked and listed mills and landowners in the areas where the river required dredging, but it was also elegantly embellished with its handsome cartouche and the delightful vignettes of all the Calder towns. If you start from the right at Wakefield, there are then Horbury, Dewsbury, Mirfield, Brighouse, Elland and Halifax, up the steep Halifax Brook on the left, all with their different characteristics. Smeaton continued to call on landowners to display this plan and explain what it proposed. But the committee felt that their careful approach had been justified, so they wasted no time. In February 1758, the bill was in Parliament. The committee stages were heard, with Smeaton acting as the main witness, a role he fulfilled, as many of you will know, for many schemes on a regular basis throughout his career. And steadily, the witnesses worked through the problems raised by the few petitions against the navigation. And during these hearings, there was a change made to the bill, which perhaps explains this end part of the map, which seems to be in a slightly different hand. A petition was accepted from Rochdale committee members and others to extend the navigation to Sowerby Bridge. They proposed the long cut, which you can see just north of the river from Salterhebble Bridge, rather than at that time pursuing the difficult and necessarily expensive climb into Halifax. The argument made for this was that from Sowerby Bridge, it was just a day's return journey to Rochdale by road, thus speeding up all trade across the Pennines. So the bill became the Act of 1758, a lengthy document. Such major projects needed a detailed explanation of the procedures to be followed, because issues like land purchase could be very contentious. And it created commissioners who were given the necessary powers to implement the work. And of course, many of the original committee became active commissioners, and they were keen to get going. Subscribers rapidly began to be found. But Smeaton needed to finish his work on the Eddystone and had limited time to give to the navigation until a year later in 1760. He helped with preparation work when he was free. He recommended Joseph Nichols from London as his deputy, a role the commissioners were very reluctant to create. And when he was in the north, he began to locate local quarries and to check possible wood supplies. He visited landowners, some of whose land would be required. And the first purchase of land was that croft of 1.5 acres on Wakefield waterfront, where the warehouse and the floodlock are today. And this was as late as February 1760. And there the works yard started to swing into full action as Smeaton's journal began in late May of that year. So over to Shirley to look in more detail at what was happening there.
Thank you, Lesley. As you will have gathered from Lesley, I have no background in engineering. So Lesley and I have been greatly helped by advice from various experts. So my apologies in advance if I explain terminology that you are already perfectly familiar with. I'm going to speak a little bit about the workforce and the materials and equipment that were required. These are described in Smeaton's journal, the minutes of the commissioners' meetings, the accounts and the letters. The superintendent's journal was prepared by John Smeaton for his employers, the Calder Navigation Commissioners, over the first 4 years of construction, 1760 to 1763. The weekly reports were copied by a clerk into a bound book of about 170 sides of script, with days of the week and dates noted in the margins. As Lesley told us, work started at Wakefield, and this is Wakefield from Smeaton's plan. We can compare the plan to the modern map that Lesley showed earlier. It shows the dye houses on the east bank, the medieval bridge across the river from the south, and the weir just above the bridge. It also shows the Goit serving the fulling mill, a warehouse on the opposite bank, and the crane on the west end of the Stennard. The proposed cut and lock across the river is shown, providing access upriver. And as we've heard, the present cut across to Fall Inn is longer and changes direction after the Doncaster Road Bridge. From the first entries in Smeaton's journal, we can get some idea of what a very busy and noisy scene it was when he first arrived at work was due to start. There would have been boats and wagons delivering timber, stone, and equipment of all sorts. The forge lighting up the area and the blows on the anvil ringing out. The sound of sawing from the carpenters and the noise of hammer and chisel as the masons shaped the blocks of stone. Large numbers of labourers, of course, would have been needed to dig out the lock pits and cuts, to work on the stone from the quarries, to prepare the work for the wood for the lock gates, and to prepare the ironwork. Some of the labour force were employed directly by Nichols and Smeaton on behalf of the commissioners. The conditions of the work the men were expected to do is revealed under the direction. Sorry, I'm just trying to move it on. It's just not, I'm sorry, it's just not moving the, moving it on at all. Ah, there we go. The conditions of the work the men were expected to do is revealed by the minutes of the commissioners' meeting on the 18th of June 1761, which stated that those employed under the direction of Nichols and Smeaton's should only work a 6-day week and a 12-hour day, unless in cases of emergency. However, undertakers or contractors with their own teams were also used. This was the case with Jeremiah Platts, who was in charge of digging out the lock pits and cuts. He had worked on the canals in Lancashire, and he was asked in April 1760 to come immediately, but it was to be his responsibility to find accommodation for himself and his team. We can get some idea of the numbers of men he employed from a letter sent by Smeaton in February 1763, when he mentioned that Mr. Platts had 130 men working on the cut at Batty Mill. Arrangements had already been made to bring equipment from the Eddystone. On the 15th of August 1758, Smeaton had written to the commissioners respecting tools, instruments, etc. We use various kinds of tackle in the Eddystone works for lifting and moving large stones, etc., which after the work is completed will be sold to the best bidder. I apprehend that these would be very serviceable in the works of the Calder. What will be chiefly wanted further at the beginning will be 2 or 3 engines of different sizes for driving piles and pumps of different kinds and sizes for draining of water. By November that year, the commissioners had agreed that Smeaton should pursue this. I'm using some of the early entries in the journal as examples of the content. Smeaton arrived in Wakefield on the evening of Sunday, May the 25th, 1760. And the following day, he writes, "This day further inspected the works and found them as follows, viz. In the workyard, a carpenter's workhouse and storehouse in one building, a smith's shop and shed for Minion in one building, and a shed for the sawyers all completed. NB, all the above buildings are made so as to be taken to pieces and set up at other places according as the different situations of the works shall require. Minion, as you may know, was a byproduct of an iron furnace which Smeaton used to make a hard cement, some of which had been provided by Mr. Cotton from his iron foundry at Hague, which is about 7 miles south of Wakefield. A considerable quantity was needed, and payments are recorded regularly in the accounts. For instance, in June 1760, 499 bushels were bought for £4, 3 shillings and 2pence. The minion and the mortar needed grinding, and this is Smeaton's diagram of a horse-powered pestle and mortar. We can see the yoke for the horse, which drives 4 pestles, with the side elevation of the mortar and pestle on the left. The journal continues. The tools, utensils, watchet, lime, etc. from the Eddystone works are arrived. Apart from the lime from Watchet in Somerset, Smeaton also bought lime from Barrow-on-Soar in Leicestershire, having experimented with it to check that it was of sufficient quality to make the hydraulic mortar that was required. And this is just one of over 100 lime kilns that have been excavated in the area. The journal continues to list what was in the yard at Wakefield. A considerable quantity of wrought azler from different quarries in the yard, and a good assortment of iron. Azler, or ashlar as we call it now, is a good quality stone, which was needed for the facing, for the sills of the locks, and the hollow posts that held the lock gates. Large blocks were needed, and in 1758, Smeaton was already visiting the quarries and assessing their suitability. This is Smeaton's diagram for the balance beams and hollow posts at Thorns Lock, which is the first lock upriver from Wakefield. Like all Smeaton's diagrams, it's detailed and written directions are added, stating that a stone post should be built into the backing. You can see the square area at the bottom, towards the bottom of the diagram. And that the collar round the post of the gate should be 3.5 inches deep. The exact angles are marked, and the detail of the join from the gate to the balance beam is shown on the right. It could take time for the quarries to uncover these large blocks. The quarries producing at first smaller stone suitable for backing and for the sets. Smeaton refers to blue stone, which has a bluish tint as opposed to others that are buff or cream, and this was a better quality stone. There are also many references to the type of stone being dug out of the cuts, and it's clearly an advantage if stone can be found as close as possible to the root. This is a map from the early 1850s that shows Addingford, which is south of the town of Horbury and about 4 miles upriver from Wakefield. It marks an old quarry which may date back to Smeaton's time. Negotiating with the quarries was often difficult, and a letter from Nichols to Smeaton dated the 17th of November 1760 illuminates this. Addingford Quarry was on land belonging to the township of Horbury, and Joseph Nichols, Smeaton's deputy, met with the vestry, the parish officers, to negotiate. They were asking for 4p a yard for the whole surface, and that when the contractors for the navigation had finished with it, it should be returned to their ownership, even if some stone remained unquarried. The commissioners wanted it to become their indisputable property, which could be worked at any future time, and suggested that the negotiation should be taken to a jury to settle the dispute. And arrangements for such juries were set out in the Act of Parliament. Eventually, agreement was made, with the commissioners paying 3p a yard and gaining all rights to the land quarried at that rate and to any depth. They were also, though, to pay for any damages that were incurred in the stone being carried away. Both cast iron and rolled plate iron were needed, and some came from the local forges. In October 1761, the previously mentioned Mr. Cotton of Hague was offering iron, and I quote, "as he has an iron forge at a place called Kiln House, situated upon the Don, to which place he sends the iron made at his furnace at Hague." Smeaton was also offered Gothenburg iron from Sweden by Mr. Isles, who had offered to supply some of the timber as well. Various payments for iron occur throughout the accounts, such as Russia, iron bar, 60 bars, and Sweden, iron 45 bars in 1760. The journal continues to describe the supplies gathered at Wakefield. A considerable quantity of good oak, elm, and fir timber, with some alder for piles, and also a large quantity of minion, almost sufficient for the summer's service in the yard. Several sets of triangles with windlasses for hoisting, and other necessary utensils ready prepared. This is the advertisement in the Leeds Intelligencer on the 10th of July, 1759. Calder navigation. Whereas a quantity of alder and beech, not under 8 inches diameter, will be wanted for the works, such persons as have any of the above mentioned materials to dispose of are desired to send an account of the quantity, size, and price thereof to Mr. John Bentley of Halifax on or before the 15th day of September next. John Bentley was the first clerk to the commissioners, but was replaced after a short time by Thomas Simpson. The supply of wood presented the same transportation problems as stone. Imported wood, usually firs from Northern Europe, could use the air and Calder. But any local source had to be close to the town or near water transport, so large quantities required would be both bulky and heavy to carry. Quality and sizes, particularly of oak, needed to be carefully checked before pricing and ordering, involving lengthy visits to view and select timber. There was a particular problem with the Tapcaster merchant, Robert Fretwell, resulting in serious disagreements between him and Joseph Nichols about the suitability of the wood. In April 1761, John Gwynn, a foreman carpenter, refused to take the wood, whereupon Fretwell simply unloaded it outside the yard at Wakefield and demanded payment. This problem may have contributed to Nichols' dismissal in November 1761, along with suspicions about his integrity. The journal continues. The horse water screw in considerable forwardness, and the carpenter at work thereupon. So this is Smeaton's 1761 design for a screw engine for the Princess Dowager, the widow of the Prince of Wales, who was extending Kew Gardens. 2 horses worked it, and it was designed to raise 13.5 gallons on each turn at 2 turns per minute. A similar one would have been used at Wakefield to extract water from lock pits and to build the weirs. Apart from the equipment brought from the Eddystone, all the rest, screw engines, pumps, pile drivers, the triangles and windlasses previously mentioned, would have been manufactured by the carpenters and smiths on site. And as we have heard, the workshops were designed to be moved upstream as the work progressed. The details of the work at Wakefield continue. This is the moulds made for the coins and hollow posts of the lock and arches for the forebays. The sawyers preparing materials for the punts, a quantity of stuff for plank piling sawn out, and some hands at work in preparing them for use. The smiths at work upon ironwork for the engine. A considerable quantity of stone from Widow Hartley's quarry delivered in falling. Some scaffold backing from Robert Hartley's quarry upon the Stennard. The same day, Monday, the 26th of May, Smeaton and Nichols marked out the ground for the lock pit at Thorns, and the labourers commenced digging. Details of the locks and cuts were listed in a panel on his plan, showing the rise at each lock, the length of each cut, the height of the dams, and the number of bridges. It must have been a great satisfaction to Smeaton to see his plans being put into practice, and the journal notes that Smeaton and Nichols staked out the cut for the first time from the lock as far as the rocky ground reaches, with very little variation from the plan. A week later, on Monday, the 2nd of June, the journal records, this day, Mr. Smeaton, having prepared the south drafts for the forebay, stern bay, stone sills for Thorns Lock, as also for the timber bridges over the cut at Thorns and Lupset, measures were taken for putting the same in execution with all possible expedition. The plan shows the 2 timber bridges, and we can understand why a cut was necessary at this point, as it mentions Lupset Ford. Here, the river is shallow and gravelly. The journal refers to these shoals in various places on the river, and every time there was heavy rain, more shoals were formed, and made a number of diagrams relating to Thorns Lock, but he also made a more detailed generic drawing of a Calder lock. It shows the various types of piling, the building up of rubble backing to support the lock walls, the sets at the bottom of the lock, the sills, the gates, and both ground and gate paddles. The rapid system for the ground also still exists. This one is at Mill Bank Lock on the route up to Dewsbury. Some of them are operated by households, this system being almost unique to the Calder and of course, this was a period of innovation. Boats were still being flushed through locks by the force of water, such as that at Kirkthorpe, a couple of miles downriver from Wakefield. As we've heard, this caused a great loss of water to the local mills, and as Lesley has explained, was one of the causes of opposition by the mill owners. Smeaton was able to employ new methods to stop the leakage of water in locks, using the knowledge that he gained from his studies at home and abroad. Nevertheless, dealing with a river like the Calder, where sudden floods occur regularly, was a great challenge, and plans had to be adapted and improved. For instance, during the 4 years of the journal, a different route was established from the figure of 3 lock near Thornhill, which you can see on the bottom right of Smeaton's plan, where it says alders in the acres, up to Dewsbury, which was known at the time as the Long Cut. On Smeaton's original plan, we can see shortcuts at figure of 3 by Dewsbury New Mill and at Dewsbury itself. We can see part of Smeaton's New Cut on the modern map, which runs through from the bottom right up towards Dewsbury, but nowadays it no longer rejoins the river at Dewsbury, ending at Savile Town Basin. In 1798, another cut to the west was made from Thornhill Lees locks, rejoining the river near Ravensthorpe. The modern map also shows that the cut now continues to the east towards Horbury. Work continued over the 4 years of the journal, moving steadily upstream, taking the smiths and carpenters' shops with them. A steady supply of materials and equipment needed to be maintained, and as each part of the navigation was opened, these could be brought up by boat. In June 1762, the journal states that lime from Barrow-on-Soar arrived at Horbury Bridge in one of the largest Gainsborough keels that can possibly come up these rivers. This keelman had with much industry been persuaded that he could not pass the bridges, and yet upon trial found about 3 feet to spare. At the beginning of May 1761, floods again caused havoc. Smeaton writes, "At Horbury Mill Cut is a terrible scene of devastation, wholly arising from the extreme looseness of the matter where this cut is dug, being almost entirely a mass of running sand and gravel, which the floods rising here very high have washed down from the banks into the cut on one side and upon the meadow on the other side. Methods of dealing with these unforeseen problems had to be constantly improvised and implemented." By the last entry in the journal for the 10th, 11th and 12th of November 1763, work had reached the Lillens, just west of Brighouse, and once again, a further problem needed to be solved as a boat had run into the cloughs and had sunk with its cargo of stone. Following the end of the journal in 1763, disagreements between the commissioners led to Smeaton, Gwynn and Scott being discharged, but work continued with James Brindley, known for his work on the Bridgewater Canal, of course, acting as a surveyor, manager and undertaker. In the winter of 1767-1768, there was another devastating flood damage to the navigation, and Smeaton returned to assess what could be done. A new Act of Parliament was sought, and as a result, the Calder and Hebble Company was created, with subscribers becoming proprietors owning shares. Eventually, in September 1770, the navigation was open to Sowerby Bridge. On the 17th of July, 1771, a celebration at Sowerby Bridge for the opening of the navigation was sponsored by some of the gentlemen with a concert on the water, fireworks and a ball. The navigation began to repay itself as investors with trade growing quickly and dividends increasing. There were many further alterations to the route and repairs and improvements required to the structures, but the navigation continued to be a success. The experience gained in planning and building the Calder navigation opened up prospects for pushing other water routes across the Pennines. Remarkably, the final 1 3/4 mile link up to the centre of Halifax, proposed in the 1758 Act, was not completed until the mid-1820s. We can perhaps appreciate the hopes of the commissioners by this image, which appeared on the subscription certificates. Here are merchants on the quayside, admiring the huge pile of goods and wool sacks, arriving and being hauled into their warehouse by crane. In the background, Demeter, the Greek goddess of agriculture, carries the cornucopia overflowing with fruit. To the bottom right, as a metaphor for human society, the bees with their hives are industrious in the production of honey. The banner along the bottom reads Hinc tibi copia, which loosely translates as hence comes abundance. Oh, we hope that we have sparked your interest in this early navigation, the building of which is brought to life by Smeaton's remarkably detailed journal and his carefully executed plans. We hope that we've helped you to appreciate the efforts of the gentlemen up the Calder Valley to establish this first Calder navigation and to imagine the scenes of industry at Wakefield and along the course as the work continued upriver. If you'd like to know more, our book provides a long introduction, a transcription of the journal, and a copy of Smeaton's wonderful plan. Thank you very much for joining us for our talk.
Thank you very much, Lesley and Shirley. That's marvellous. I'm tremendously impressed by the efforts the promoters went to try and turn away opposition before it happened. I'm sure if you're happy to, you would we'll have some comments and questions. So if anyone would like to unmute yourself and make a point, please do so.
All quiet.
I think you're right about it was in that period people were very civil to each other. Civility was the important the description of sort of those middling people, the merchants and people like that, and they you know, it was very effective, I think. You know, They
Yes,
they could deal with all types of people by being very civil.
yes. I was thinking about comparison with present day
Yes, yes.
civil engineering works. We have a question as to whether there's a Smeaton journal surviving for the Leeds branch.
There's quite a lot of paperwork that Smeaton didn't. Obviously, it was quite a lot before Smeaton's time, the Aaron Calder, but he did do a fair amount of consultation on that, I think. I don't think he managed a project on it, but he tended to become, in lots of places, more of a consultant. I mean, that's his preferred mode. He didn't really want to be at the beck and call of the commissioners all the time. He wanted to leave Nichols in place and go off and do other interesting projects as well. Even on this project, he wasn't there all the time. There are patches of several weeks in every year where he was disappearing off somewhere else to look at a different project. So, you know, it was and that's what he was trying to sort of create, you know, the idea of a consultant engineer and a resident engineer. So Nichols would be the resident and he would be the consultant. But of course, the commissioners didn't see it that way. They thought they'd paid for an engineer and that's what they needed. So.
And my apologies for, I see that my notes were making noises, so my apologies if that made things awkward, and to be remembered for further talks as well. Perhaps got a bit close.
I wonder whether you know about the book that was the survey that was done just after your period in 1805-6 for the Calder and Hebble Company, which plotted a map of the whole length of the navigation and identified all the landowners.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to note that the landowners that appear on that map are very similar names or the same families that you put forward as the original commissioners.
Yes, and
the same families own who still own the land. Savills in particular.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
yes.
that map is beautiful. You know, it held in the West Yorkshire History Centre, and we did indeed look at it and looked at the changes from the 1760s, from the original Smeaton's diagram plan.
I'm glad to know it survives, because
yes.
I was afraid when British Waterways moved their offices, it might have been lost. So that's good news.
Yeah, it's in Wakefield, in the Wakefield History, the History Centre, the West Yorkshire History Centre, in the archives there, and it's still in beautiful volume. There are quite a few Calder and Hebble papers there as well.
And in good condition and beautifully coloured as well.
But Smeaton's map is spectacular as well when you look at it in detail. In the book, we've taken sections of it, so as well as a whole picture of it, so you can see it all.
Any other comments?
May I make a comment, please?
Please do.
I absolutely love looking at Smeaton's drawings, technical drawings, and the map you've just been talking about. A real revelation. I knew nothing about him until today. Well, I don't recognise the name, but that was about it. And I really do want to get hold of your book if I possibly can. My personal interest at the moment is in the Staffordshire and Worcestershire Canal from its very early days, which of course had Brindley as its well, what you term the consulting engineer. And I was also fascinated that Brindley took over the Calder navigation when Smeaton was dismissed. I didn't quite get the date that happened, but
that was almost after the 4 years that he worked on it, that are in his journal.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think there was a bit of there was an argument between the people from Halifax and the people from over the Pennines, Rochdale and Manchester, because really the Halifax people wanted the canal to go to Halifax, and the people over wanted it to go to Sowerby Bridge so that they could get over the Pennines faster. So I think that there was some kind of argument amongst the commissioners that made that happen.
And what was the date again? Sorry, to
1763 to 4, I think, around there.
and Brindley took over immediately after that, did he?
I'm not absolutely certain we've
It'll be in the
understood
book.
that. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean,
Smeaton was back by 1760 after the winter of 1767-68. So maybe that may be the period that Brindley was there.
No, I think there were other people as well. I think
Possibly.
A lot of the people who worked on the Calder, this Calder navigation with Smeaton actually went on to do a lot of the other work across the Pennines in various routes, you know.
Well, I've got a feeling that the winter of '68 was foul. I'm thinking of the primary sources that I've got for the Staffs and Worcester. But Brindley, I wasn't sure whether Smeaton was dismissed because he wasn't there enough. You know, you suggested that the commissioners wanted a resident engineer and they got a consulting engineer. But of course, Brindley would have been exactly the same because he was all over the place.
Yeah, I don't think it was that. I think it was more this argument about what should happen next between the commissioners, really. And the greater influence of commissioners from over the Pennines who'd actually, you know, who were supporting the idea of Brindley taking over. I mean, the weather was terribly bad. It was appalling in the end of the 1960s. Yes.
Well, wasn't that the time when the Great Viaduct collapsed? Oh heavens, where's that? On the Bridgewater. I'm sure that was around that time. Yeah. Okay. I don't want to hog this, but I was just wondering whether, and I'm going to have a look at this now. The locks that were built on the Calder, I wonder how much they influenced the locks that Brindley was responsible for on the Staffs and Worcester, Trent and Mersey, and the BCN. A fascinating line of research. So thank you.
And he does talk at the evidence to the parliamentary when they took it to parliamentary, and the witnesses, they were talking specifically about how the lock gates needed to seal over the sills, and they had the master house carpenter, His Majesty's master house carpenter, was spoken about at Deptford, was it? I think, explaining how how to stop loss of water actually through the mitred gates.
Yeah.
I think all these things, I mean, people learn from each other, don't they? And people moved around. There were a lot of people working on this, and those people who learned from it sort of became significant in their own right.
And
like Jessup, his apprentice. I mean, you know.
Right. One more thing. Sorry, and then I will shut up. When you said there was a second act of Parliament, originally the whole thing was run by the commissioners. The shareholders became proprietors. Well, of course, that's the model that appears in the Trent and Mersey, the Staffs and Worcester, and then the BCN Act of Parliament, where you've got proprietors who are in effect shareholders, with commissioners as a kind of super body above them. And again, I thought that was really interesting.
They were quite idealistic about the funding of it. It was George Savile who didn't want people to make extreme profits, because people really didn't like the Aaron Calder undertakers, the people who funded that. They felt, a lot of people in the area felt that they took enormous profits from it. and George Savile sort of set the tone of we're not going to do that. You know, we'll put the money in and we'll take our 5% and then we'll have our money back, and things will go into repairs and improvements. So yeah,
but they put a cap on shares on the later canals. I think it was 20,
right, yeah.
20, I think it was initially. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Hi, do we know anything about the workforce? I mean, were these the original Irish navvies?
I don't think so, possibly. I think that it's not clear from what we've tried to read about it. It's tended that's developed more as more and more of the canals got built, and of course into the railway period. I think they used a mixture of local people, and then the teams like Platts obviously had his own team, and some of the others. They might have been Irishmen, yes, indeed, but
and they were doing they were doing the nastiest job as
yes,
well.
The digging. But there's no mention, put it that way, of them being Irish.
No, we don't. I mean, we don't know much about the workforce at all, really. You know, it's one of the aspects of it that's unpleasant, really. You don't learn anything about how they manage these. You know, they were like
or even about accommodation,
assistance,
where they, you know, they talk about accommodation, and we don't know whether that was, you know, really temporary accommodation, or whether there was a way of putting them up in places in town. I mean, Wakefield was a thriving place at the time with plenty of inns, and the numbers we're not clear on. Obviously, there's this mention of 130. Whether that was a regular number to be digging out of the locks and cuts isn't clear. And how, you know, how they were employed. I think they tried to keep those regularly employed, the diggers, but certainly people in, you know, their own employees sometimes, you know, would just be employed for a particular job. But they increasingly they got sort of undertakers who took on the particular roles. So Platts was doing the digging, and somebody else, I think what was he called? I can't remember. It's Luke Holt, isn't there? Who was Wood. Who was and in charge of the and somebody else on the stonework. So you know they ran the teams. It made it a lot easier. Nichols had to be paying a lot of people, but it was easier to pay the undertakers, who then paid their workforce, and that's what they moved into. And there was also comments, of course, about problems of keeping them on site when the harvest was happening. You know, the workers would disappear to the harvest. So that was the first couple of years. That would be local people, wouldn't it? I think. Yeah. So it was an unknown area, really.
It would also have been the early days of coal mining as well in this area, wouldn't it?
Oh, yes. I mean, there'd be a lot of opportunities for work. Certainly, yes. I mean, it was a thriving area. There were the wool industry, obviously, was, you know, was really motoring at this time, and and the towns were very, very busy, and and coal as well. And you know, obviously it was a useful, it was an additional thing for quite a lot of coal mines around Wakefield that later on fed into this part of the navigation. So, you know, they were carried on boats from that sections of the navigation. I can still remember some of the places that were up the navigation. You could see where they came down.
Keith Noble, would you have another?
Yes. We used to have a member who had a theory that you showed us the lock gate, the drawings of the lock gates, and his theory was that these were cribbed from the locks on the Canal du Midi in France. He was pursuing a theory. I don't know whether he ever came to a final conclusion about that. The sad thing is, though, that the locks built to that design, when I first knew the Calder and Hebel 50 years ago, there were still quite a few locks built to that design. Obviously not the original gates, but still built to the same pattern. Of course, when they moved the workshops from Shepley Bridge, which were the Calder and Hebble workshops, to Stanley Ferry, which had been the Ayr and Calder workshops, the design of the new gates after that period didn't follow the Calder and Hebble design. So now you can't find any of them that actually match what Smeaton originally intended.
Yes.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. And we were able to see, one of the things we went to see whether they were replacing the lock gates at Thorns Lock, not the original one, but because it's a double lock, the other lock. So that was interesting seeing it. You know, them putting the gates in place and the drain lock and so on. And that was, of course, done from Stanley Ferry. It was
Yes.
done by Stanley Ferry.
It's very little used as the Calder and Hebble. You were going to say something, weren't you?
Well, yes, I've always felt it's been sort of right at the bottom of the tourist trade and rather sadly dismissed, you know, compared to because I don't know whether I mentioned my only real knowledge of canals was that from holidays in the 1970s. And there's the really popular canals like the Cheshire Ring and the Oxford, and I always feel that the Calder and Hebble tends to be sort of towards the...
Well, I don't think many people go up it at all, really.
No.
It's hard work compared with the working the locks on the narrow canals.
Yes.
And that dissuades a lot of people.
Yes, I can imagine.
Any further points from anyone?
If I just a quick one. Further point, in Waterways World this month, there is an article about the Calder and Hebble navigation.
And we saw that.
Do we?
It was in the
yes.
in that
In that
magazine.
one.
Yes, we had seen it. We had seen it. Mm-hmm.
Just a quick one about the cribbing of the lock gates. The Stamford Canal actually did use that type of double gate, but that was 100 years before the Ayr and Calder and the Bridgewater Canal. The problem was nobody knew about it. It was off the beaten track. It was the wrong side of the A1, so no one knew it existed. So it never got recorded until about 1953. So history needs rewriting, and I'll be doing that to the Society after the new year. So I'll speak to you all again soon.
Oh, that's brilliant. Trying to think where it would go.
Okay, if there are no further comments, I would like to reiterate the Society's very sincere thanks to Shirley and Lesley for a wonderful presentation. I think we've all learned a lot from it, and I sense that everyone's enjoyed themselves. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Yes, thank you.
Yes, not at all. Just a reminder, I think I'm correct in saying that next week at the same time, we have a presentation presented by the Southwest Group, which will be on funeral trains. So something a bit different, but something else which you're very welcome to attend. So thank you to everyone for coming along virtually, and good afternoon to everyone.
Oh, very good. Yeah.
Do we leave?
Right, we need to leave.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.